Hey there, AP Environmental Science class. All right, welcome back to part 2 of my lecture on Chapter 4, Biodiversity and Evolution. We pretty much talked about the biodiversity part of the lecture in part 1, and now we're going to move on to evolution here in part 2 of my lecture on Chapter 4. Again, there are about 19 slides or so hoping to get through this in about 20 minutes or so. All right, so evolution depends on genetic variability and natural selection. So we did talk about genetic variability and natural selection a bit in part 1. We're obviously going to talk about it more right now. So Darwin and Wallace independently proposed the concept of natural selection in the 1850s. We all know about Darwin. We kind of forget about Wallace, and Wallace was also kind of on parallel paths to Charles Darwin, kind of doing the same thing. So both of them kind of independently proposed this idea of natural selection. Genetic variability occurs because of mutations. What are mutations? They are random changes in DNA, and some can result in heritable traits. That's pretty much what natural selection is, right? We have these mutations that happen in our genes, right? If a mutation happens to be something that helps an organism survive, well, then that mutation, right, will end up making that organism survive better, right? So the organisms without that mutation aren't going to survive as well. And so over time, the organism with that mutation ends up becoming the dominant organism, right? As that mutation, because it helps with survival, helps that organism survive more. And so over generations, that mutation becomes part of the species, right? If it's the opposite and the mutation hurts with survival and doesn't help survival, well, then obviously those creatures die off and that trait doesn't get passed on, okay? And that's what we talk about when we talk about natural selection, okay? We're talking about those traits. All right, so moving on here, natural selection, again, kind of what I just talked about, is environmental conditions that favor increased survival and reproduction of certain individuals in a population. What are those certain individuals? Those certain individuals are ones that get this mutation that helps them survive better than maybe the same species without the mutation. And this is how we evolve. This is how evolution works. An adaptive trait improves the ability of an individual organism to survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals in that population, again, given the prevailing environmental conditions. So that's what we're dealing with when we're dealing with natural selection and evolution. Genetic resistance is an example of natural selection at work. This occurs when organisms have genes that can tolerate a chemical designed to kill them, okay? Resistant individuals survive and reproduce. So genetic resistance is what we're going to talk about when we talk about pest control coming up in a couple of chapters. Basically, human beings have come up with pesticides that we spray to kill pests. Well, what did we just learn in the previous chapter, previous part, right? Insects have a tendency to reproduce very rapidly. So what happens is you have this pesticide that kills insects. Well, guess what? One or two of the insects usually have a gene that can tolerate the chemical designed to kill them. So it kills off all the insects without the gene that can tolerate the chemical. But let's say two of those are left. Well, those two then reproduce. And now you have a body of organisms that can tolerate the chemical designed to kill them. Again, it doesn't happen like this, but with insects, it happens rather quickly because they go through so many generations. They reproduce so rapidly. And this is how then insect populations basically get immune to the pesticide. Then you kind of come up with another chemical pesticide. So what we're going to talk about in a couple of chapters is that the best way is what nature would do. Put predators in that like to eat the insects, and then the predator and the prey evolve together. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And that is a better way to have pest control than by spraying pesticides. Some disease-causing bacteria have developed resistance to antibacterial drugs, antibiotics, kind of in the same vein here. In fact, a lot of times it's told if you are sick, don't always go to the doctor and get an antibiotic, because a lot of times these disease-causing bacterials are resistant to that antibiotic. You really, a lot of times, want to let your own immune system kind of deal with the bacteria. Now, again, I'm not telling you not to go use antibiotics, definitely not saying that. But again, the more antibiotics you use, similar to the more pesticides you use, the more better chance that a bacteria, because they reproduce so rapidly, will get a mutation that will be resistant to that antibiotic. And then over time, you have a bacteria population that, again, is resistant to the antibiotics, and that can make the antibiotics less effective. So again, something to think about, okay? And this is basically what I'm talking about just in visual form, right? You have the normal bacteria. Here's a group of bacteria, normal in blue. They're resistant to whatever, again, pesticides or antibiotics or whatever. You have two. So most of these die off, right? But you have the one resistant here that then will obviously, bacteria are kind of they're not mating per se, they're kind of just breaking in two, and that's how they reproduce. But it would work the same for creatures that are mating. They mate together, and now you have this larger ones that are resistant, few still that are not resistant. But over time, again, the bacteria resistant basically take over because of evolution, because of natural selection, and now you have some bacteria or some pests or whatever that basically aren't going to be affected by any pesticide or antibiotic. Patterns of evolution can be traced and compared using an evolutionary or a phylogenetic tree. All right, and looking at one of those right here is this is basically a simple tree of life. All right, starting with those protocells, going to your bacteria, and then coming up, you have the fungi, plants, and animals on each part of the tree here. So something that you can look at, and again, you don't need to memorize this, but have a general idea of what it is telling us. Okay, limits to adaptation through natural selection. So adaptive genetic traits must precede change in the environmental conditions. So basically, you have to get that adaptive trait before the environment changes. If the environment changes too quickly, which is what we're seeing now, unfortunately, most animals, outside of maybe insects or bacteria that reproduce so rapidly, it takes time, right, for these genetic traits to become dominant. So unfortunately, they kind of have to precede or kind of those changes in the environmental conditions. A population's reproductive capacity, species that reproduce rapidly and in large numbers are better able to adapt. So we'll talk about how insects, we just did, they're better able to adapt to changes in the environment because they reproduce so quickly and in large numbers. People like, let's say, human beings, even though we can use our technology, but let's say panda bears, right? They don't reproduce that rapidly. Maybe you get one panda bear born every couple of years. So they have a hard time adapting to changes. All right, so 5 common myths about evolution through natural selection. Survival of the fittest means survival of the strongest. That is actually a myth, okay? It has nothing to do with being the strongest. It just has to do with having genetic variability that helps you survive a little bit better than someone without that without that gene. That's really all it means. So it really has nothing to do with strength per se. It has to do with just being able to survive better than other organisms of the same species. Evolution explains the origin of life. We don't know exactly how life originated initially, how we got those living cells. We have an idea, right, that we had these molecules, right, organic molecules in some kind of soupy waterish thing back 4 billion years ago. And then somehow, maybe through lightning or some other type of catalyst, they formed into living cells. We're not exactly sure. Humans evolved from apes or monkeys. That's actually a myth. We did evolve from apes or monkeys, but not directly. Right? It wasn't like we were an ape yesterday and then all of a sudden became monkeys. There were many intermediary paths that humans took. And actually, like the Neanderthals, there were some branches of the human tree that actually dead-ended. So again, a little bit of a misnomer there. Obviously, if you go back and trace it, we originated from some sort of ape or monkey millions and millions of years ago. But again, it wasn't a direct. Humans evolved into another form, right? Lucy, right? The African remains that we found from millions of years ago. Okay, saw that the human being was starting to stand upright, but definitely wasn't exactly like we were now. Evolution is part of nature's grand plan to produce perfectly adapted species. No way. Again, evolution just has to do with the best available way to survive. Definitely not perfectly adapted. Nothing is going to be perfectly adapted. And I'll use an example of our eyes. Our eyes, if you've ever noticed, and I'm sure you have, right? Our eyes get very watery when they get very dry, right? They're really, believe it or not, our eyes really aren't a great adaptation for land. What happened was we humans, most mammals, we started in the ocean, right? So we had fish eyes. Then when we got out on land, our eyes evolved just enough to allow us to survive on land. They didn't make our eyes perfect, though, to be on land. And this is why your eyes water when they get dry. This is why many of us need to wear glasses and contacts and things like that, because our eyes are not perfectly adapted to be living on land, okay? They adapted just enough to allow us to survive better than, let's say, a previous human example, or someone further down in our tree of life, the human tree, that maybe had eyes that still were a little blurry or something like that, seeing on land. So our eyes are just good enough to allow us to survive on land, but they're not perfect, right? If they were perfect, we wouldn't have all the issues we have with watery eyes, your eyes drying out, things like that. Evolution by natural selection is not important because it is just a theory. Again, this is a pretty, while theories, we can't 100% prove them with looking at the fossil record and just looking at how things have happened, even in the 150, 200 years that we've kind of known about natural selection, just watching things, we're pretty confident that natural selection is how creatures, how plant and animal, anything that's living on planet Earth actually evolves. Okay, I think I skipped one here. All right, so next we're going to go into what factors affect biodiversity. So now we're going to take what we learned about biodiversity and evolution and kind of talk about how now those all play into affecting biodiversity on planet Earth. So new species arise in two phases. Number one, geographic isolation. This occurs first. Populations migrate or are separated by some other cause. Then you have reproductive isolation. This is when mutation and change by natural selection occurs in the geographically isolated groups, and this eventually prevents breeding between the groups and eventually creates two totally different species. So what can you think? You can think of the old Pangea, right? That supercontinent that we had on Earth a couple of 100 million years ago, right? And if you remember back from Earth science, one of the things that we knew that we had continental drift was that Africa fits into South America, right? Kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. So think about this, okay? 250 million years ago, the two continents were combined, right? You had, let's say, a squirrel living, no problem, running across. All of a sudden now the continents begin to separate, right? So now you have these two squirrels living on either side. Africa's moving in one direction, South America's moving in another direction. There you have now your geographic isolation, right? These populations didn't migrate per se, but they were separated by some other causes, in this case, plate tectonics, right? So then what happens? You have these two squirrels living now as the tectonic plates, as the continents are pulling apart. They're now in two different geographic areas, and as a result, the climate, the environment begins to change. So now you have natural selection occurring on those that species of squirrel. But in South America, the natural selection is a little different than it is on the African continent, because you have different environments, right, on the two continents as they begin to pull apart from one another, right? So now you have the squirrel in South America by natural selection evolving one way, the squirrel in Africa by natural selection evolving in another way, and eventually they become so distant from one another that they can't breed anymore and produce viable offspring. So what are they? We now have two different species. More biodiversity, right, on the planet. So now we went from one species and we turned them into two species. That is what we talk about with geographic isolation and then reproductive isolation. So here's just another example of this, right? You have this early fox population that spread northward and southward and separated. So this wasn't plate tectonics, but this was some sort of migration. Then what happens up in the Arctic, right? It's always cold and snowy. So the Arctic fox, obviously the one that mutated to have a white coat, did better, right? Survived better because they were able to hide from predators because they blended in with the snow. Well, down in the southern states, you don't want a white coat, right? If you live in Texas or anywhere really in the U.S. where there's not snow all the time, a white coat's going to make you stand out. So the foxes that moved south through natural selection evolved into having more of this gray coat. And obviously other things were going on as well. And now you basically have two different species of fox, the Arctic fox and the gray fox. And that's more biodiversity. So this is how it happens, how the biodiversity happened on planet Earth through this natural selection because of either geographic or reproductive isolation. So Science Focus 4.2 kind of talks about what I talked about with the Africa and South American example. Tectonic plates affect evolution and the distribution of life on Earth. Locations of continents and oceans have shifted through geologic time. Species move and adapt to new environments, allowing for speciation, or those new species to be created. Earthquakes can separate and isolate populations, and volcanic eruptions can do the same. They can destroy habitats, which obviously then cause a species to change, do natural selection, because the environment it's living in changes, and therefore traits that were once good for survival in one environment, not necessarily good for survival in another environment. So through natural selection, that organism changes, and now you have a new species forming. So again, just kind of showing this. This was the example I gave. I guess I gave it a little too early. Here was Pangea joined. Here we are now. And again, if you were living down here, right, on the South America and Africa, and kind of hanging out down here, when Africa went one way and South America went the other way, you were separated, and eventually a couple new species were formed. All right, so let's now talk about artificial selection, genetic engineering, and synthetic biology. So this is something that obviously has only really been occurring in the last 50 to 60 years. So what is artificial selection? It is selective breeding or crossbreeding. And actually, let me back up. That actually is not true. Crossbreeding has been done since Egyptian times. So I do want to check myself there. When we get into genetic engineering and synthetic biology, that's what's only been around for the last 50, 60, 70 years. But artificial selection, this is actually what, again, we've seen this happening thousands of years ago with, let's say, wine grapes, right? People in Italy, people in Greece, people in Egypt, they were creating wine, and they were selecting the grapes that worked the best in their community, on their environment. And they knew by crossbreeding one type of grape with another that they would be able to get the type of grape that would grow well. So this has been going on for a long time, again, called artificial selection. It's selective breeding, occurs between genetically similar species, not a form of speciation, very slow process. Genetic engineering is a way to speed up the process of artificial selection, and that is by gene splicing. Okay, so what are the steps to genetic engineering? Well, we identify a gene with a desired trait in the DNA from a donor organism. And again, this is relatively new. We extract a small DNA molecule called a plasmid from a bacteria cell. We then insert the desired gene into the plasmid to form a recombinant DNA plasmid. And then we insert that into the cell of another bacterium that divides and reproduces large numbers of cells with the desired trait. So that's how we do genetic engineering. Then we transfer the genetically modified bacteria cell back to a plant or animal that is to be genetically modified. And now we have what we call a GMO, a genetically modified organism. All right, so let's just look at those steps once again. We identify a gene with a desired trait in a donor organism. We extract that DNA molecule. Okay, we extract a small DNA molecule from a bacteria cell. We then insert that desired gene into that plasmid, that bacteria. We then take that and put it into the cell of another bacteria that divides to produce large numbers of cells with that trait. Then we transfer that trait back into the plant or animal that is to be genetically modified, and now we have a genetically modified organism. Synthetic biology takes segments of DNA are used to design and create artificial cells, tissue, body parts, and organisms not found in nature. So that is what is synthetic biology. So again, just kind of looking at the genetic engineering here. Again, here we have a pear and an apple. The desired trait of the color is red. So we do some crossbreeding, pear and apple, and we get now an offspring that has an apple that's red, but also some pears and apples that are kind of oranges. But here we go, a pear that's red. So this was our best result. We now take that red pear and breed it again with the red apple, and eventually the new offspring has the desired result of a red pear. Okay, so this is kind of a simplified version of how that genetic engineering works. Okay, finally, we're going to talk about, got a couple of slides left. We're going to talk about what happens when species do not adapt quick enough. We have extinction. So extinction eliminates species. Extinction is a process in which an entire species ceases to exist. Endemic species are found only in one area, and they are particularly vulnerable to extinction, like the panda. Okay, we only find that panda, right, in that narrow niche, right, that it lives in, and therefore they're particularly vulnerable. Humans, we're found everywhere. So we're not particularly vulnerable to extinction because we live all over the place. Background extinction. So typically there is a low rate of extinction that goes on. Usually about 0.0001% of all species per year go extinct. And that's basically what we call background extinction. That's going on no matter what is happening in the background. We seem to lose species every year. But again, it's a very, very low number. Mass extinctions occur when you get a significant rise of extinctions above that background level. So in a mass extinction, 20 to 95% of the species on the planet are eliminated. Causes are unknown, but could include volcanic eruptions, collisions with meteors, asteroids, things like that. While extinctions are bad, they're also good because they actually provide opportunity for evolution of new species. So that's what happened when the dinosaurs became extinct, right? The dinosaurs became extinct. About 80 to 85% of life on the planet died out. But what didn't die out? Little mammals. And those little mammals then evolved to become us. So I would argue that if we didn't have the mass extinction that killed the dinosaurs, we probably wouldn't be here as human beings, because dinosaurs would still be controlling the earth and would never have allowed mammals to get their footing in, right, to become the dominant species, because the dinosaurs were. So with the dinosaurs gone, mammals became the dominant species. So again, what's bad for others sometimes is good for some, and that's what we find a lot of times with these mass extinctions. So you'll notice we've had a bunch of these. We basically have had 5 mass extinctions, okay, in the past, going back to the Ordovician. 50% of animal families were gone. The Devonian, the Permian, we almost lost life on this planet, guys, because about 90% of animal families and 95% of marine species became extinct. So that was it. If we have to start over, it would have been tough to get to humans. But we still had some life. So then Triassic, 35%. Here's the dinosaur one, the Cretaceous one, 80%. And it looks like now we are in currently known as the 6th mass extinction. And the reason why is that currently we are seeing species become extinct at a much, much higher rate than that background extinction number that I showed you. So it looks like the current extinction crisis is caused by human activities. Many species are expected to become extinct within the next 50 to 100 years. Again, if we don't change what we're doing to the environment, because we're changing the environment so fast, right, that species aren't able to adapt through natural selection, and therefore they're just becoming extinct. So that's one of the reasons why we have this course, right? One of the reasons we have this course is we're trying to understand that so that we can stop it. Okay, we need to stop this 6th mass extinction that we as human beings are creating. All right, the final slide here, adapt, migrate, or go extinct. When the environment changes rapidly, species have only 3 options, right? Polar bears reproduce slowly, but environmental conditions they depend on for survival are changing very quickly. And this is the problem. You can only do one of 3 things. You can adapt, you can migrate, or you can go extinct. Well, it's very hard to adapt when it's happening so fast. It's also very hard to migrate when environmental conditions are happening so fast. And as a result, this is why we seem to be in the 6th mass extinction currently, because creatures are not able to adapt and migrate because we're changing the environment so quickly that unfortunately their only choice is to become extinct. And obviously that's not a choice, but that's just what occurs. All right, so that's it. That's chapter 4, biodiversity and evolution. And as always, thanks for listening.